Hello and welcome. Thank you for tuning in, where we connect the dots between MarTech and marketing landscape. Stay tuned to MarTech 360 as we explore key strategies for your marketing success.
Hello and welcome to MarTech 360 podcast, where we cut through the noise in marketing technology and go-to-market strategy with people who actually build and scale things. I'm Samarth from Data Demand, and if you're leading a digital team right now, this episode is going to challenge some assumption you didn't know you were making. With technology intersection that we are in, there are a lot of noise about the gap between growth activity and the real growth outcomes. And that gap between what looks like a growth and what actually growth is exactly today's guest lives in. Matt Pratter, EVP Innovations at OuterBox, brings something rare to the conversation. Over 14 years of experience spanning both agency, brand side of digital marketing, he has led teams in performance marketing, analytics, and those teams have consistently delivered real business impact. Matt has led award-winning work, including some of the earliest applied uses of generating AI in performance marketing. He is not someone who chases the next shiny tool. He is someone who asks whether the tool actually changes the outcome. The perspective is exactly what this conversation needs. Matt, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
Perfect. So Matt, I want to start with the perspective, we have given the background on what we are talking about. We're going to break some myths. I want to start with your perspective that only comes from time, from having lived in both sides of the world, which is agency, brand relationship, because I think the most useful thing about 14 years spending in this industry isn't about the tactics you have accumulated. It's about the belief you had to revise. So over 14 years of agency and brand role, what changed your mind the most about how growth actually happens?
Yeah, I think back to, early in the days when I started launching Facebook campaigns, back in 2011. I feel like we were chasing the wrong things. The brands were trying to build their Facebook page likes. Websites were trying to just generate a lot of traffic, leads. But what we know now is not all traffic is created equal. And, we learned to pay more for quality, even when some of the front end metrics like CPCs started to look crazy. If conversion rates and lifetime value back up a high initial cost, I'll play that game all day. And it's the right trade-off. So moving to the brand side was really where I got some of this real education. When you're in a company and not everyone speaks marketing lingo, I had to re-explain a lot of what we think of as basic concepts to people who are engineers or product designers, supply chain people. I thought that one brand meant that it would be simpler marketing, but what the reality is, with more stakeholders and more complexity, more context is needed. And, at the end of the day, growth isn't really a marketing problem. It's a business systems problem. And that's ultimately what led me back to agency life with a much wider lens.
Right. And you made a very valid point. It is, marketing is not about one particular aspect. And do you think that, with that shift leads directly to something that I think the most important question in digital marketing right now is that almost nobody asks it loud, because there are people who are very good at producing a matrix that looks like growth. Impressions are up, clicks are up, conversation or the conversion rates are improved. And, we all celebrate. But, isn't that growth? It's a measurement of the right things in the wrong context, which we talked about the systems, and the wrong things altogether. So in digital marketing, what real growth looks like, but actually isn't?
Yeah, I think it's kind of like the early, front end metrics that I was talking about. So traffic without intent, or something like a Facebook page likes. I mean, we spent real budget chasing an audience that we didn't really own at the end of the day. Same thing goes with lead generation. If you're flooding the funnel with leads that don't convert, a bad lead at a high volume is still just expensive noise. Vanity metrics dressed up in dashboards, it could look like a win in a single slide deck, but as soon as you start to scrutinize, it falls apart. I think of a campaign a few years ago that I ran for a high-end hair care company. We had recently acquired the client, and they had a creative agency that had been working on a TikTok campaign for them, and they wanted to generate a ton of views. And we picked it up right at the end, and as a performance agency, we're like, what are we measuring here? And it was kind of too late in that process. So it's like, okay, we're going to run the campaign. We got a ton of views. I think it generated something like 2 billion views on TikTok, and everyone was super excited. CMO was high-fiving everybody on the calls. But then as soon as we start really trying to see the business impact, the definition of success wasn't there, and it ended up just being a very expensive billboard. So, views, impressions, reach, these are all really inputs and not outcomes. And real growth shows up in revenue, retention, and margin, not necessarily the metrics that are just easy to screenshot and throw on a dashboard.
Right. No, I completely agree. But don't you think that, those small steps, which is about the conversions, the metrics that we spoke about, they lead to the revenue?
Absolutely. But oftentimes, if you chase, metrics like ROAS, if you want to maximize ROAS, you're going to fall into the trap of not building a repeatable system that generates traffic in the long term. So if you get, cheap sales in the short term, great. You can have some really good ROAS. 6 months later, you might have used up all your audience pools, and then your ROAS is going to fall off. Your revenue isn't repeatable, and you're kind of back to square one.
Right. I agree. And probably this is, something that the most common is about the false growth, if we can term that specifically, because of the data, because data usually backs that, which brings me to something which sounds almost industry standard right now. Everyone says that they are data driven. Now, in your experience, where does the data most often mislead leadership instead of clarifying decision? Because that's the biggest thing. Everybody says that, we look at a particular set of data, we drive information from it and create strategies. But in your experience, where does the most data, does it, often mislead instead of clarifying? What are your 2 cents on it?
Yeah, I think, looking at any single KPI and having tunnel vision where one number becomes the truth of success is a trap. So, CPC is like the perfect example. Back in the early days of search, we'd be optimizing just to minimize CPC. But optimizing that alone doesn't really tell you anything about the business health. And, ROAS is a little bit better, but it's still limiting. So if you're only maximizing ROAS, you're likely leaving scale on the table, or you're using up all of your audience and not generating new demand. So we're looking at metrics kind of like incremental ROAS. Are the other conversions you're actually counting caused by the ad, or would they have happened anyway? So executives tend to anchor to what's easiest to measure, not always what's the most meaningful. But data, like you said, gives you confidence. Confidence in the wrong metric, though, is worse than uncertainty in some cases. So you can miss the forest for the trees. You can have technically accurate data, but strategically misleading conclusions. I really think the best teams ask, what question is this metric actually answering before they actually act on it?
No, absolutely. I completely agree, because usually, the best solutions comes from the people who question the real intent and the outcome. And in my opinion, the data usually gets filtered through what the leadership wants to see. And by the time it reaches the room where the decisions get made, they are just focusing on those particular metrics, like you talked about, CPC and the early days of Facebook. So if data can, and it wouldn't be wrong to say that data can mislead as well. And then the AI, how can AI be even more important? Because AI doesn't just use the data, which means if your inputs are flawed, the output is flawed faster. And you were the early adopter of a generative AI in performance marketing, and which you actually used to improve the outcomes, not just experimenting. So where have you seen AI create true competitive advantage in simplifying, accelerating, mediocrity?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think back to like when ChatGPT first became available to the consumer, and it immediately felt different than anything I'd seen before. So we started really simple. Like I'd feed it some Google style questions and was really blown away by the results. Quickly answering questions that you don't have to sift through search results or ads. And then you start testing harder and harder asks. And to your point, it became very clear that garbage in is garbage out. The key insight, I think, is if non-technical people can get good enough answers, what really sets the great answers apart? And I think that's good data in. You're seeing more use cases of robust structured data. We were starting to feed RFPs into the LLMs, and you'd get a reasonable draft response within a few minutes. Same thing with like keywords for a search campaign or ad copy at scale. That became table stakes though. That's fast unlocks. I consider any agency not using these tools to be way behind. But I think the real unlock comes with orchestrating a lot of these models together. And I think whole careers and models will be built on this orchestration. And I think back to the creative pilot that you mentioned, one of the earliest examples of this orchestration. We had a lot of retail clients who have a vast catalog of like flat photos of like a model with a white background. That's not necessarily an ad that you can put in Facebook though. So we orchestrated through a few different LLMs, text generation and background generation to match different personas so that we could target those at scale. And by feeding the engines more and more of these combinations and letting them match on the back end for signals that we don't necessarily have levers to pull on the front end or even visibility to see, we're able to get insane performance gains by multiplying out these different ad combinations, but also just letting the algorithms kind of pair those. And really, I think it's a trap in you can accelerate mediocrity with poor inputs if people are using LLMs like an expensive search engine. But once you start putting some strategy and thought behind micro-targeting personas to many different combinations, you start to really see a gap. And I think the gap between average AI users and sophisticated ones is really starting to widen and not close.
Right. I completely agree here. There's a certain element that, certainly AI can amplify things. It can scale to what extent we are looking. But for that, you need, judgment, strategy, and, tons of data with the visualization of what is your intended goal. Like you rightly mentioned, garbage in is garbage out. So, people exactly need to know or probably, research well, before they dive in, because AI can execute at scale. But it can't tell you whether your market actually believes that right now or not. That's the experimentation. Because there's a tendency in performance marketing, go straight to the activation, test the ad campaign, optimize the landing page, run the experiment. And, with all that optimization is happening on top of assumptions, which were never validated. It was based, about who the buyer is, what do they care about, what actually moves them, because people do connect with them. Like you mentioned that, with the plain background, you converted them to the personas matching. So how can original research-based buyer surveys, industry insights, create a stronger foundation for campaign strategy before activation? Do you think that, it is relevant, or, still you should work on your instincts?
Yeah, I think that's the question, right? And performance marketers, like you said, default to activation. We're wired to just launch and optimize, but optimization of the wrong message is just really efficient failure. I think the planning stages are more and more important now that the outputs that you can get in LLMs are becoming commoditized. So anyone can put in a few keywords and generate a bunch of ad copy, but buyer surveys, industry research actually surface what the market is leaning towards before you can even spend a dollar. And knowing the real objections, real language, real purchase triggers will change the creative strategy fundamentally. And at my current agency, OuterBox, we try to find the intersection between AI and human expertise. So really empowering our team and not replacing them with AI by giving them access to these tools that they can complete more thorough research, go through the strategic brief process that makes every downstream channel smarter. So SEO, paid, CRO are all going to perform better when they're built on a shared understanding of the buyer. And really, that's the difference between just running ads and building a campaign with conviction behind it.
Right. Right. Because off lately, the attention span of people have gone down. There's tons of content that we consume on a daily basis, in every format. Brands are experimenting with different channels, within that. The average, people can't focus more than 10 minutes on a particular problem unless it's a big pressing one. Would you agree on to that?
Yeah, I think 10 minutes might even be generous.
Absolutely. So, with that less attention span and, our minds are constantly experimenting. And same goes into digital media, because I understand that how fast paced this is. You have client targets, you have internal pressure, you have external pressures. How do you decide, what deserves a serious investment versus what's just interesting? Because that is where, the roadmaps keeps changing. The people who are at the execution stage, they change. But how do you decide, and what deserves that serious investment?
The honest answer is really the proof is in the pudding. I'm willing to test almost anything with the right expected outcomes. But the framework is a risk reward analysis up front. And we really want to stress test with pilot clients, limited use cases, because I've absolutely been wrong before. And, that's exactly why test and evaluate structure matters. Interesting, get to small budget and a clear success metric. Investment worthy has shown signal in a controlled environment first. And then, the mistake most teams make is skipping that pilot phase and going straight to scale on the excitement. Right. Curiosity, I think, is a big asset here, but undisciplined curiosity can be very expensive. So, only scaling things that have proven signals over time, over several different personas or geos, gives us more comfort in adding more scale and more investment.
Right. But, that requires constant discipline of experimenting, curiosity, understanding, and testing. Because not all the 10 ideas would scale, or, they would, show the proof of concept. Because discipline will help you scale. And, which is the most unappreciated distinction in performance marketing. Because, when we are executing, we are just thinking of executing, and discipline or experimentation takes the step back, and digital marketing or the environments, they're fast moving. How can, program managers, leaders, tell the difference between, the campaign, which is well optimized, and then when, the one actually is tapping into the real market demand? Because that's a very interesting, while you are testing and executing, you need to understand the difference.
Yeah. And really, optimized campaigns are hitting their KPIs. It's, you're hitting the CPC, you're hitting the ROAS, but demand-driven campaigns pull people towards you. And I think the signal difference is, are you pushing or are people leaning in? So if we're looking at organic behavior alongside paid performance, are people searching, sharing, coming back? Is there that share voice growth. Engagement quality over engagement volume is what I really care about at the end of the day. Comments show more comprehension, more engagement versus just passive scrolls and alike. And really, a campaign can be beautifully optimized, but completely wrong for the moment. So I think real demand shows up in metrics that you didn't entirely manufacture. Say it's branded search lists, unaided awareness, direct traffic, word of mouth. I think the ultimate test is if you turn spend off and everything stops, that's optimization. If things keep moving, that's demand that you generated.
Right. Right. Yeah. And that brings me to a very interesting point here. And I have observed it while, working on multiple channels. Demand usually is changing, the kind of content that we produce, or the traffic is moving from the legacy search engines to the LLMs. Now the entire digital space is getting fragmented. Any early traction that appears that tells you it's genuinely safe to scale because it's ever evolving. What are the warnings, signs that you suggest that demand hasn't truly yet validated?
Yeah, the validation piece over time, I think, is very important. And, I think back to the TikTok campaign I mentioned earlier. 2 billion views, no success definition, no way to measure the impact. That's scale without validation. Another anecdote I'm thinking of are trends or fads like fidget spinners. I remember when those first came out, drop shippers were going crazy. They'd go all in on the and then all of a sudden they end up sitting on mountains of inventory as soon as the craze died. So scaling before they had that time validation. So, the warning signs, I think, are when you don't have a clear definition of success before launch. Metrics can feel good, but don't connect to revenue or repeatability or lifetime value. And, traction from, a niche audience like, a TikTok audience who has a dance craze or kids that have the fidget spinners everywhere doesn't necessarily mean traction from a scalable market. So I think the ask is, does this hold across different audiences, geographies, or creative angles? And, if unit economics only work at low volume, scale is going to break the campaign. So I think ultimately it's safe to scale when the pilot proves repeatability, not just one lucky run.
Right. I completely, I agree. And I really like the way you described it, that, the scale is needs to be validated across all channels. Perceptions, people have the gut feel about the drop shippers. There's a product which is hit and everybody wants to ride the wave, and suddenly they are sitting with a huge, pile of inventory stock being sold. And, that is something that needs to be validated across the channel. And most of the digital, agencies, they have, and most in-house teams are organized by channel. They want to create a structure. There's a SEO team, there's a paid, the PR team, or a CRO team, a web team, somebody who is optimizing backlinks, somebody who is creating more, creating more channels independently, which means that nobody is owing the entire full growth system. All are working in the silos. That determines the loss of value, or rather than the value leaks within the system. OuterBox integrates SEO, paid media, CRO, web experience, instead of running isolated channel teams. What fundamentally changes when the growth is, orchestrated as a system rather than a collection of campaigns? Because all these teams they work in silos.
Yeah, anyone that's worked at an agency has heard that feedback from a client, right? I feel like the channels are disjointed. They're optimizing for their own metrics. And the truth is that it's often at the expense of the other channel, right? So SEO and paid might be bidding against the same keywords, whether they're trying to prioritize it organically or actually paying for clicks. CRO changes that break landing pages, or email and display campaigns that are out of sync. This is very common across agencies, and I've seen it pretty much everywhere I've worked. And, when they're properly integrated, the signals feed back into each other. So SEO insights sharpen the paid targeting. CRO learnings improve the organic content, and web experience supports every channel. And I think highly structured data signals feeding the machines is the compounding advantage. So one of our solutions on the analytics side at OuterBox is called Loop. And we're constantly scoring our leads and feeding that information back into our planning phase. So we have full visibility across all the channels into which of these leads came in via separate sources and what the actual value of those leads are. And that could be, semantic analysis through AI or actually listening to phone calls. But it takes a little bit of, diligence in taking the extra time to understand the quality. I think for a lot of our clients in the small and mid-market, especially need this. They can't really afford redundancy or wasted spend like a big enterprise client might. And I think the human layer that ties it all together is vertical specific expertise. And that is what AI alone can't replicate. So our team are specialized in several different verticals and work with business owners who are passionate about what they've built, not really the marketing stack. So we understand their pain points and we hire people that have deep knowledge in these industries who can wield these tools correctly.
Right. And probably, when you have a great team who is equally passionate about the customers, a great product itself, that's a compounding effect, at a system level thinking, and that exactly what separates leaders, to the followers. While the industry that we are, it's ever evolving, ever changing. There are new tools that are coming in, which they say that they solve a particular problem. There's always a new tool to adopt. There's a new channel which is emerging, another one, which is dying. There are algorithm changes. There are quite a shift that is happening in the digital space, around the clock. Search engines, sending out their updates. People getting terrified with where the shift is moving. So, in your opinion, between from now to between 12 to 18 months, where do you think that this is heading? And while the industry debates the next AI headline, what is your recommendation on that?
Yeah, I think back to like the early SEO days when, Google Panda update like breaks all these business models. And I think we're seeing a similar thing now with AI and the rapid evolution of these LLMs. If you've flown into San Francisco recently, you've seen the billboards, I'm sure, on the way into town where everyone's talking about AI. But I think really most leaders are pushing AI adoption at the surface level. Some are going to implement a chatbot and call it a day. I think the ones who are willing to suffer short-term losses to completely overhaul how their business operates are going to be the ones that are hardest to catch. If we look through a historical frame, computers or the internet, the companies that won weren't the ones who just added tech to old models. I'm thinking of companies like Amazon or Netflix. Netflix didn't improve the DVD rental model. They just made it irrelevant. So, if you're looking at like Blockbuster versus Netflix or Redbox, they were still optimizing for DVDs while Netflix was streaming from your phone. That was once unthinkable that the Blockbuster would become irrelevant. But I think we're about to see a gap like that emerge again. And some companies who are willing to overhaul the way that they operate are going to win the decade. And the debate about which AI tool to use is really a distraction. The true question is, how deeply are you willing to rewire your business around it?
I completely agree. AI has changed the way we look at business problems. AI has given us a different perspective altogether. The major use case that we still use is, in the most incorrect manner is the automation. Automation is something that can help us scale but it has given us another perspective. And I believe the AI is here to stay. It's just that you got to be friends with them. All right. All right, Matt. I think, we have covered a lot of ground, in terms of what real growth looks like, where the data is, where data misleads us, how actually AI is playing out a role in practice, when to scale, when not to. There's a lot of growth momentum driven through the systems, and what's coming in. Let me shift gears. Quick questions, honest answers, no overthinking, just your gut answers. Are you ready for that? Quick fire questions.
Love a rapid fire. Let's do it.
All right. Okay. No thinking, no overthinking. One growth matrix that leaders trust too much.
I think it's any single growth metric. Who cares about CAC if you don't know your LTV?
Got it. That's a brilliant answer. AI today, structural shift or temporary edge?
It's definitely a structural shift. This is the internet moment and not just a feature release that we've seen in the past.
Right. Performance or brand, which compounds more over time?
Brand, always. There's a reason Nike and Coca-Cola are who they are.
All right. One mistakes, experienced digital marketing teams still do or repeat.
Probably the sunk cost fallacy. So staying on a broken strategy because of what's already been spent.
Right. Okay. This one is interesting. Decision paralysis or data abundance, bigger threat right now.
I think data abundance causes decision paralysis. They're really the same problem.
Right. But data abundance is nobody knows how to use the data.
That's true. And they're going to feed it into the LLM and get a generic answer if they don't think about it more seriously.
Garbage in, garbage out. Nothing coming out.
That's right.
Right. One signal that tells that, you are a growth engine is your growth engine is truly scalable.
I think it's back to the point about unit economics holding or improving as you add volume.
Right. Unit economics improving and?
They either hold their metrics or as you add volume, they're improving.
All right. One trend most marketers are underestimating right now.
Good old-fashioned research.
Good old-fashioned research. I agree with you, because that's the base of thinking, experimenting, designing, and understanding more with the help of AI. Perfect. That's a perfect place to land, Matt. Thank you for clarity, the directness, and a straight conversation that puts a lot of thought into the industry that is still at the cusp of making a bigger shift. What stands out from this conversation is sustainable digital growth isn't a channel problem, a budget problem, or a tool problem. I think it's a clarity problem that, that is what we have discussed. For listeners who want to follow Matt's work and explore what OuterBox is building, connect directly. Where do they find you, Matt?
You can find me on LinkedIn. You can find us on outerboxdesign.com or probably on other podcasts.
How active you are on LinkedIn?
I'm decently active. I post at least weekly, and I usually try to give my friends a hard time by dropping funny comments on their posts as well.
Perfect. Thank you, Matt, and everyone listening. Thank you for tuning into Martech 360. If this episode helped you to understand a little more about performance, digital marketing, signal, and what digital growth actually is, do like us, comment, and share with someone who needs this conversation. At Data Demand, we help B2B team cut through the noise and understand what their real signals are actually saying, and not just what the dashboard shows. If you want to build a growth engine grounded in real demand, head to datademand.com. We'll be back with more conversation from the people shaping and pushing how digital market or growth is changing the landscape. Thank you so much for tuning in.
We are signing off from this episode of Data Demand, but the journey doesn't end here. Stay tuned to MarTech 360 for more insights and strategies that can help you master the MarTech landscape.